All right, Stephen Garrett, congratulations on the impressive 12 Emmy nominations that were received for The Night Manager. You were one of the executive producers of it. Did you expect this to happen at all when you guys were making the film for television? I mean, were you surprised at all?
Yes. I mean, as you may be able to detect from my voice, I'm British. And, you know, we have a tendency to expect disaster and failure. So if we hoped for any, we might have gone for kind of half a handful. So 12 was breathtaking, and we were thrilled, really blown away.
So let's talk a bit about adapting this for television. It's based on a John le Carré novel. They've been trying to adapt it into a film for a number of years. Talk about your involvement in it.
Well, I got approached quite early on by Simon Cornwall, one of le Carré's sons, who's one of the founders with his brother Stephen of the Ink Factory. They made contact and said they'd made a couple of movies out of le Carré, were in the very early stages of development on The Night Manager, and had never made TV before. And rightly or wrongly decided that I had some track record in successful high-end TV drama, and wondered whether I might like to join the team to take the kind of creative exec lead. And having been, since schoolboy days, really obsessed with le Carré, and in fact it was le Carré's novels who inspired my own show Spooks way back at the turn of the century, I couldn't have been more thrilled. They already had Tom Hiddleston and Hugh Laurie attached, and they had 2 scripts, first drafts. So that was it. That was the raw material, and that's how I began. And it was a pretty thrilling, sometimes tense journey.
Well, let's talk about what some of your duties as an executive producer of this are.
Well, I mean, there are, as you and your audience will have seen, a lot of executive producers knocking around on not just this show, but many others. Some of them, it's fair to say, do more than others. So I was pretty involved. So I suppose a couple of the key things I did very early on, we had to find a director. And we cast the net far and wide. And I approached Susanna Bier, who I'd not worked with before, but had been a huge fan of her work. And part of the attraction of Susanna was, for me, and I suppose, again, this is an attempt to answer your question, what does an executive producer do? What you're trying to do is just build a team that is going to add value every step of the way. And because 2 things you might say about le Carré is he's very male and very British. So the idea of having someone who is very not male and very not British seemed appealing, because I think I've tried where I can to play the game of coming at stories from a slightly left field position and shaking them up a bit. And Susanna seemed like someone who might do that. Nothing could have prepared me for the extent to which she did that. And I mean that in a very good way. I mean, she couldn't have been more brilliant. And the thought I went into her with, and in fact, you're talking to me now in my house in LA, and I initially Skyped her from LA in my kitchen, and she was sitting in her library in Copenhagen. But one of the things I first talked to her about was an idea I'd had bubbling around for a while, because going back to that point about feeling that there was something not quite working about those early drafts, and one of it, in a way, was the very maleness of it. And the character that Olivia Colman ended up playing, Burr, was in the scripts I read still a man, which he'd been in the original novel. So I'd suggested to my colleagues that we needed a stronger female presence in the story just to make it feel more 21st century and make it more interesting. Burr seemed the obvious character. So I put that to Susanna, and she was immediately excited by that. So I'm going, again, what does an executive producer do? There are 2 things. And you then, as I say, I brought in a producer as well, a British producer, to be very hands-on, a brilliant man called Rob Bullock. And you start with this sort of top of the pyramid, and then this sort of rather wonderful process of recruitment goes on as you start to build your head department, deepen the casting. And if you've made those initial first choices well, good starts to flow. If you've messed that up, it's just a kind of cascading disaster. So it's quite a responsibility in those early days.
So one of the most impressive things about this show is just how big and expansive it is. I mean, you're going to several different continents and locales. So talk a bit about just the nuts and bolts of putting together a production this big.
Well, there's no point pretending it's not terrifying, because it's a kind of military operation, and it's difficult enough if you're just in one place for the entire duration of a shoot. We had, it was almost a joke in a way how peripatetic this story was. And but again, all credit to my colleagues and partners at the Ink Factory. They did a brilliant job at raising the money, and we were just very well funded. Not crazily well funded, but it just meant if we wanted, as Susanna insisted, that we do start our story in Zermatt in Switzerland, brackets, the most expensive ski resort in Europe, close brackets, then that's what we do. It turned out, and I hope Susanna will forgive me for saying this, that the reason she was so insistent, not just on Zermatt, but the particular hotel where we shot that first meeting between Pine and Roper, Hugh Laurie and Tom Hiddleston, was that apparently Susanna had been conceived there.
Oh, wow.
So we didn't realize why she was quite so insistent. It happened to be perfect for the show, but that's why she was excited to reacquaint herself with that particular venue. But I mean, the other key location, I suppose, was Roper's Villa, which has aroused a lot of interest. And the truth is, it was so important that this feel appropriate, that it feel like kind of part fortress, part villa, but not in a kind of Bondian sense. The distinction between Le Carré and Fleming is that Le Carré's world is grounded, and if at any point it looked as though Roper lived somewhere where a missile might emerge from a silo at any point, we knew we'd have got it wrong. And so we entrusted our location manager with this particular task of finding a villa. And we said really anywhere in Southern Europe. It needs to be on the sea, but let's find the villa and then we'll build our shoot around it. And we'd given him a couple of pictures to say, this sort of thing is what we're looking for. And one of the this sorts of thing was in fact that villa. So he said, you want something like this? I've got this exact place. But that was in Mallorca, and we then built 6 weeks of our shoot around Mallorca. The other key element was the Egyptian setting and the scene that dominates, or the scenes that dominate the opening episode in Egypt. Egypt's slightly volatile. There wasn't huge enthusiasm to try and film there. So Morocco seemed like the best paradigm. And so again, we turned a rather wonderful hotel in Marrakesh into our Egyptian setting. And again, everything flowed from that. And we found then half an hour outside Marrakesh was a desert setting where we could actually build Roper's camp and a refugee camp. So there was a kind of, it became organic once we'd made those key decisions. So Zermatt, Marrakesh for Egypt, Mallorca for the Roper Villa. And then Mallorca provided the setting for, you know, when the caption goes up, you can sort of fool anyone. You just put a caption up, it looks vaguely plausible. So we said Istanbul, it looked like Istanbul. Monte Carlo, it looked like Monte Carlo. We got away with it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, it's amazing how big and expansive and cinematic this thing is. Now, you've worked both in film and television. I wonder if you could talk to some of the differences between producing for the two, and are those differences becoming fewer and fewer?
I think the two worlds are fusing, and I think this, you know, this is more cinematic than much cinema. And there are a lot of movies we go to that are more televisual than much of television. I mean, I think the interesting thing what we did and about this particular story is it's essentially a 6-hour movie. So the way you shoot it, the way you structure it, the way you tell the story is no different from the way you'd approach a movie. It's not self-contained episodic TV. And I think that's what drew Susanna to it. And again, what's extraordinarily impressive, and it's worth just singing their praises, is unlike most episodic TV, Susanna Bier directed every single episode of that and kept in her head an unbelievably fragmented narrative structure. And again, it's a great tribute to the actors too. And again, David Farr wrote every single episode. If you take, for example, the fiery, steamy relationship between Jonathan Pine, played by Tom Hiddleston, and Elizabeth Debicki's Jed, they had to shoot their relationship backwards. So they started with the ending and ended with the beginning. And the subtleties of that are really hard to navigate, even if you're doing it sequentially. When you're shooting your, as it were, climax, very early in the shoot, and not creating the moment at which you meet until many weeks later, to keep all that in your head, both as an actor and as a director, is a really remarkable achievement. But I think, again, it's what you do in the movies. But this was we had 75 days of shooting, and with no break. So the energy and stamina required to do that, again, for the core creative team, is really impressive. And I'm not talking about myself in this. I'm talking about the people who are on set every day, all day, in at times very difficult conditions. Though we did, again, there was sort of, when you go to places like Morocco, there are a number of interesting additional factors to deal with, not just the intense heat, but we had, with our Moroccan crew, they provided a member of the crew that I'd never come across before, and I'd like one on every future shoot I'm a part of. They provided a snake charmer.
Oh, wow.
And the snake charmer was there, needless to say, to make sure there were no snakes. We're a little suspicious of this guy and weren't really sure that he had any particular skill set. And in fact, there were no snakes, which means he was either very, very good at his job or there were no snakes. But Susanna, who was not a fan of snakes, decided that as we were all very skeptical, this man became her personal snake charmer. So he stood by her chair every day that we were in the desert, and nobody got bitten.
Well, good for that. Can you give us any more tidbits from the set, this 75-day shoot? Any other interesting behind-the-scenes stories?
Well, we had one of Roper's bodyguards, who went by the name of Tabby. You may remember him, the sort of giant bearded guy, was played by an actor who had actually been the professional boxing heavyweight champion of Spain for a number of years. So you really didn't want to mess with him. But he was a kind of gentle giant and became the crew's mascot. What we then discovered is that, having retired from boxing, he did what all boxers do, not. He became first a poet and then a stand-up comic. Anyway, on the very few occasions when I thought I might be overdoing on kind of crew snacks, and I went to the gym early morning before our day started, he was in the gym training our entire makeup and wardrobe department, who'd adopted him as their trainer. So we had this really wonderful community. It was because we were all staying in this hotel that was also our set. It was a remarkable atmosphere, but he was an extraordinary figure. And again, because we were in Spain, he was like the Pied Piper. Wherever he went, people followed. We also had a great moment when shooting, in fact, in our hotel in Marrakesh, where Tom Hiddleston was playing the eponymous night manager and doing a sort of through the night shoot. And again, for those who've seen the show, where Pine is meeting Sophie Alican for the first time, he's alone really at the reception desk. When we were shooting the establishing shots and our crew was very far back in the reception area, Tom Hiddleston was there alone. The hotel was still functioning, and on 8 times, separate families came through and tried to check in, thinking Tom was really the night manager. And he was torn between being delighted that his performance was so authentic, that he was being treated as if he were a manager of a hotel, and on the other hand, a little annoyed that people hadn't recognized he was Tom Hiddleston. Anyway, it happened over and over again.
Wow. So what's next on your schedule? You're working on another Le Carré adaptation for TV, is that right? Spy Who Came In From the Cold?
Yes, we just announced The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and a long-time collaborator and friend of mine, Simon Beaufoy, who's famous for Slumdog Millionaire and Full Monty, neither of which you'd have thought necessarily were Le Carré paradigms. Anyway, he's going to write it. But he's a fabulous writer, and I think that's going to be very exciting. And then again, there are other projects too early to describe, but I'm faintly obsessed with spies, so I'd be very happy if I never told any other stories that didn't have spies in them.
Well, I certainly look forward to it. Thank you so much, and congratulations on the Emmy nominations, and it was a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to meet you. Bye.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.